One choice, one moment, one love story. Welcome to When He Chose Her. Enjoy the story. Come to the gala with me. I could use the entertainment, Ethan Caldwell said, not even looking up from his phone as the crystal glass in his hand caught the warm amber light. His voice casual, careless, the kind of tone that came from a man who had never once questioned whether the world would bend to him or not. And around the table his friends laughed, low and knowing, because they understood exactly what he meant, and exactly what she was supposed to be in that moment. Background, a passing amusement, a story to tell. Later overexpensive whiskey. But Clara Whitmore didn't laugh. She didn't even flinch. She simply stood there with her order pad resting lightly against her palm, her posture straight, her expression calm, as if his words had landed somewhere far away from her, somewhere unimportant. And when she finally spoke, her voice was soft but clear, steady in a way that made one of the men at the table glance up without realizing why. "Sure," she said, meeting Ethan's gaze for just a second longer than necessary. "I'll bring something unforgettable." And then she turned, already moving toward the next table, leaving behind a silence that lingered half a second too long before the laughter resumed. Louder this time, sharper, like they needed to fill the space she hadn't acknowledged. Ethan smirked, shaking his head as if amused by his own joke. But there was something about the way she had looked at him. No fear, no eagerness, no attempt to impress, that stayed with him longer than it should have. Like a note played slightly off-key in an otherwise perfect composition, he dismissed it quickly. Of course, because men like Ethan Caldwell didn't dwell on waitresses. They built companies, closed deals, moved markets. They didn't wonder why a server didn't react the way she was supposed to. And yet, as the evening went on, he found his attention drifting back to her without permission, noticing small things he hadn't intended to notice, the way she handled a difficult customer with a quiet firmness that didn't invite argument, the way she anticipated what people needed before they asked, the way she never rushed, even when the restaurant filled with the kind of high-profile guests who expected urgency. She moved through it all like she understood something the rest of them didn't, like she wasn't performing for anyone. And when one of his friends snapped his fingers to get her attention, she didn't respond immediately, not out of defiance, but because she was finishing what she was already doing. And somehow that felt more deliberate than any confrontation could have been. "You see that?" One of them chuckled, leaning closer to Ethan. "She thinks she's better than this place." Ethan let out a quiet laugh, though his eyes stayed on her a moment longer. "No," he said, almost to himself. "She just doesn't think about us at all." And that, for reasons he didn't bother to examine, bothered him more than it should have. Across the room, Clara placed a plate down with careful precision, her movements efficient but unhurried, as if time itself adjusted around her rather than the other way around. Her coworker leaned in as she passed, whispering with a grin, "Girl, you serious about that gala thing? You don't even own heels." Clara's lips curved just slightly, not quite a smile. "I own choices," she replied, and kept walking. Outside the windows the city moved in its usual rhythm, taxis flashing by, lights shifting from red to green and back again, the quiet hum of a world that never stopped. Inside, something subtle had shifted, though no one could quite name it. Ethan finished his drink, setting the glass down with a soft clink, already thinking about the gala, the investors, the deals that would shape the next quarter, the next year. His world measured in numbers and outcomes, predictable, controllable, and yet somewhere in the back of his mind, uninvited, a single thought lingered, not loud, not urgent, just there, steady and unresolved. She said she'd come, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan Caldwell realized he had no idea what that actually meant. The next evening arrived with a kind of quiet precision that matched the city itself, every light in Manhattan turning on one by one as if rehearsed, every street humming with purpose, and inside a glass-walled office 40 floors above it all, Ethan Caldwell stood in front of a mirror adjusting the cuff of his tailored black tuxedo. The fabric flawless, the fit exact, the image complete, everything exactly as it should be. His assistant's voice echoed faintly from behind him, listing names, confirming arrivals, reminding him of the investors flying in from Chicago and San Francisco. The kind of details that usually occupied his full attention, but tonight something kept slipping through the cracks, a distraction he could not quite name. The Caldwell Foundation Gala begins at 7 sharp, she said, scrolling through her tablet. Press will be limited, but the guest list is extremely high profile. Ethan nodded, barely listening, his reflection staring back at him with the same calm confidence that had built his empire. And yet there was a flicker there, something unsettled, not visible enough for anyone else to notice, but present enough that he could not ignore it completely. He checked his watch, a subtle motion, almost instinctive, then reached for his phone, scrolling without purpose before stopping on nothing at all. He exhaled softly, placing it face down on the table, as if that might quiet whatever thought refused to leave. Miles away, in a quieter part of the city where the buildings were older and the lights softer, Clara Whitmore stood in a small apartment that barely held more than the essentials, a single window letting in the fading glow of evening. The air still, the kind of stillness that comes before something changes. She looked at herself in the mirror, not adjusting, not correcting, just observing. Her reflection simple, understated, her hair loosely tied back, her expression calm. The same calm she carried through crowded dining rooms and impatient customers. But tonight there was something else layered beneath it. Not nerves, not excitement. Something quieter, more certain, like she already knew how the night would unfold. Her phone buzzed once on the counter, a message from a coworker. "You are really going, right?" Followed by another. "Please tell me you are not wearing that same black dress." Clara glanced at the screen, her lips curving just slightly, then set the phone aside without replying. Instead, she reached for a small envelope resting near the edge of the table, her fingers brushing over it briefly before opening it with a deliberate motion. Inside, a single card, minimal, elegant, the kind that did not need explanation. She read it once, then again, not because she needed to, but because she understood what it represented. Not opportunity, not luck, but choice, always choice. Back at the restaurant, the evening shift moved with its usual rhythm, plates clinking, voices overlapping, the soft hum of a space that never quite stopped. Clara stepped behind the counter one last time, tying her apron with practiced ease. Her coworker Mia leaned against the wall watching her with raised eyebrows. "You are really serious about this," she said, half amused, half curious. Clara nodded once, adjusting the sleeve of her uniform. "I said I would go." Mia laughed softly, shaking her head. "Girl, that man invited you as a joke." Clara met her gaze for a moment, not defensive, not offended, just steady. "Then I will give him a better one." Mia blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of the answer, then smiled despite herself. "You are something else." Clara did not respond. She simply untied her apron again, folded it neatly, and placed it on the counter, her movements unhurried, precise, as if each action carried more weight than it appeared. Outside, a black car waited at the curb, its engine running quietly, almost invisible among the traffic. Clara stepped out into the evening air, the city alive around her, and for a brief moment she paused, not to hesitate, but to take it in, the sound of distant horns, the glow of streetlights reflecting off polished windows, the feeling of something shifting just beneath the surface. She exhaled once, then moved forward, back in the office tower. Ethan's phone lit up again, a message this time from one of his partners. "Tonight is going to be huge," followed by another. "Do not forget the Whitmore Group representatives will be there." Ethan's thumb hovered over the screen for a second. The name unfamiliar, insignificant. He locked the phone without responding, reaching instead for his jacket, slipping it on with effortless precision, the final piece in a carefully constructed image. Downstairs, his driver opened the car door as he approached, the city reflecting in the polished surface of the vehicle. Everything in motion, everything aligned. As Ethan stepped inside, the door closing softly behind him, he glanced once more at his reflection in the tinted window. Perfect, composed, controlled, and yet somewhere in the quiet space between one thought and the next, a single question remained, unspoken, unanswered. What exactly had she meant when she said unforgettable? And for reasons he could not explain, he found himself wanting to know. The gala venue shimmered like a carefully constructed illusion, glass and steel rising into the night sky, while warm golden lights spilled across the entrance, reflecting off polished black cars that arrived one after another with quiet precision, each door opening to reveal someone important, someone expected, someone already known, and Ethan Caldwell stepped out among them with the ease of a man who belonged exactly where he stood. Cameras flashed in controlled bursts, not overwhelming but deliberate, capturing moments that would circulate in the right circles by morning. He adjusted his jacket once, subtle, automatic, then moved forward without hesitation, greeted by names, handshakes, measured smiles, everything familiar, everything predictable. Inside the ballroom, the air carried a low hum of conversation layered over soft music, crystal chandeliers casting light that seemed almost too perfect to be real. And Ethan moved through it all with practiced confidence, acknowledging investors, exchanging brief words with partners, every interaction efficient, intentional, until his gaze paused, just for a fraction of a second, on something he could not immediately place. Not a person, not yet, just a shift in attention across the room. Like a ripple moving through still water, he dismissed it, continuing forward, but the feeling lingered, quiet, persistent. Near the entrance, a second car arrived. Not louder, not more extravagant, but somehow different. In the way it slowed, the door opening with a soft click that barely registered above the city noise, and Clara Whitmore stepped out, not rushing, not hesitating, simply arriving. The fabric of her dress caught the light in a way that seemed almost deliberate, every detail precise without trying too hard, elegant without needing to prove it. The kind of presence that did not demand attention but received it anyway. The valet paused for half a second longer than necessary, not because he recognized her, but because something about her made him unsure whether he should. She offered a small nod of thanks and moved forward, her steps steady, measured, the city fading behind her as she entered the glow of the event. Inside, conversations shifted subtly, not stopping, not breaking, but adjusting, as if the room itself had taken a breath it did not realize it needed. A woman near the entrance turned first, then another, their eyes narrowing slightly, not in judgment, but in recognition of something they could not immediately define. Clara did not look around to see who noticed. She did not search for approval. She simply walked, her gaze forward, her posture calm, as if she had done this 100 times before, and perhaps in some way, she had. Across the room, Ethan paused mid-conversation, his attention pulled again without warning, this time stronger, clearer. He turned slightly, his eyes scanning the crowd until they found her, and for the first time that evening, something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not enough for others to notice, but enough that he felt it, a moment of stillness, unexpected and uninvited, because the woman walking into the gala was not the person he had left behind in the restaurant. Not the quiet waitress holding an order pad, not someone who blended into the background. She moved like she belonged, not as a guest, not as an outsider trying to fit in, but as someone who understood the room better than most of the people already in it. Ethan's grip tightened slightly around the glass in his hand before he set it down, his focus narrowing. Ignoring the conversation still happening around him, he took a step forward, then another, not rushing, but no longer entirely composed either, because something about this did not align with what he knew, what he expected, what he controlled. Clara reached the center of the room and stopped, not to hesitate, but to acknowledge, a subtle pause that allowed the space to settle around her. A man approached, older, distinguished, his expression shifting into recognition. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his tone respectful. Almost relieved, Clara inclined her head slightly. "Good evening," she replied, her voice the same as before, soft, steady, but now it carried differently, not quieter, not louder, just clearer, as if the room had finally decided to listen. Ethan stopped a few feet away, close enough to hear, not close enough to interrupt, his mind moving faster than his expression revealed. Whitmore, the name echoed once, then again, connecting to something his assistant had mentioned earlier. Something he had dismissed without thought, and for the first time that night, Ethan Caldwell realized that the evening he believed he had orchestrated was no longer entirely his to control, and Clara, without raising her voice, without changing her expression, had already begun to rewrite it. The music did not stop, the conversations did not collapse, but something in the room had shifted so subtly that only those who paid attention to silence could feel it, and Ethan Caldwell was one of those people. He watched as Clara Whitmore continued forward, not seeking him, not avoiding him, simply existing in the space as if she had always belonged there, and the man who had greeted her stepped slightly aside, making room, not out of politeness, but out of instinct, the kind that comes when someone recognizes presence without needing explanation. "We were hoping you would attend tonight," the man said, his voice low, respectful. Clara gave a small nod. "I prefer to observe before I participate," she replied, her tone calm, unhurried, as if she had said similar things many times before. Ethan moved closer now, no longer content to watch from a distance, his steps measured but deliberate, his mind already working through possibilities, connections, anything that would explain what he was seeing, because this did not align with what he knew, what he had assumed, what he had dismissed so easily just hours ago. He stopped within reach, close enough that she could sense him without turning, and for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, the kind of silence that carried weight, not awkward, not uncertain, just present. Then Clara turned, her eyes meeting his, steady, composed, the same eyes that had looked at him across a restaurant table. But now the context had changed. And somehow, so had the impact. Ethan let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but not quite. "You came," he said, the words simple, but lacking the confidence he usually carried so effortlessly. Clara tilted her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the obvious. "You invited me," she replied, and there was no accusation in her voice, no hint of sarcasm, just a statement of fact. And that made it land heavier than any sharp remark could have. Ethan nodded once, his gaze briefly shifting to the room around them before returning to her. "I did not expect," he paused, searching for a word that would not reveal too much of what he had assumed, what he had misjudged, but finding none that fit, Clara finished it for him, not unkindly. "That I would show up like this," she said, her tone still even, her posture unchanged. Ethan exhaled softly, a small admission hidden inside the movement. "Something like that," he said, and for a second, the corner of her lips curved, not quite a smile, but close enough to suggest she understood more than he was saying. Around them, a few more guests had begun to take notice, not in an obvious way, but in glances, in subtle shifts of attention, in the quiet recognition that something interesting was unfolding. "You are full of surprises," Ethan added, his voice lower now, more focused. Clara shook her head slightly. "No," she said. "I am consistent. People just do not pay attention until it benefits them." The words were not harsh, but they carried a quiet truth that made Ethan still for half a second longer than he intended. He studied her then, really studied her, not the dress, not the way she had entered the room, but the way she held herself, the absence of performance, the lack of any need to impress, and for the first time, he felt something unfamiliar. Not discomfort, not exactly, but something close to it, something that did not fit neatly into the categories he was used to managing. "Whitmore," he said slowly, testing the name, connecting it to the fragments in his memory. Clara did not react immediately. She simply watched him, allowing him the space to arrive at whatever realization he was approaching. "You are with the Whitmore Group," he continued, his tone shifting as the pieces began to align. Not a question anymore, but not fully a statement either. Clara inclined her head slightly. "Partially," she said, and that single word carried more implication than a full explanation ever could. Ethan's jaw tightened just slightly before he relaxed it again. The movement controlled, practiced, but the realization had already landed. The company his team had been trying to secure a partnership with, the name he had dismissed earlier that evening, the detail he had considered insignificant, was now standing in front of him. Not across a boardroom table, not introduced through formal channels, but here, in a moment he had never anticipated. "And the dress," he said, his gaze flicking briefly to the fabric that caught the light so effortlessly. Clara followed his glance, then looked back at him. "I designed it," she said simply. No emphasis, no attempt to impress, just another fact, and this time, Ethan did not respond immediately, because there was nothing left to dismiss. Nothing left to reframe. The narrative he had built at the restaurant table had quietly, completely unraveled, replaced by something far more complex, far less controllable. And as the music continued and the room moved around them, Ethan Caldwell realized that for the first time in a very long time, he was no longer the one setting the tone of the evening. And Clara Whitmore had not raised her voice once to make that happen. The realization did not explode. It settled, quiet and heavy, like something undeniable finding its place, and Ethan Caldwell stood there for a moment longer than he should have, his usual instincts. Calculating, adjusting, recovering, but this time the process was slower, not because he lacked the ability, but because for once the situation was not built on information he controlled. Clara Whitmore had already moved beyond the moment, not waiting for his reaction, not needing it. She turned slightly as another guest approached, a woman in her late 50s with a sharp gaze softened by genuine respect. "Clara, it has been too long," she said warmly. Clara's expression shifted just enough to show recognition. "Margaret, I was not sure you would attend," she replied, and the familiarity in her tone was subtle but unmistakable, the kind that comes from shared history rather than recent introductions. Ethan watched the exchange, his mind connecting names, faces, networks. Margaret Hensley was not just another guest. She was a key investor, someone his company had been trying to impress for months. And yet here she was, speaking to Clara as if she were the more important presence. "I would not miss this," Margaret said, then lowered her voice slightly. "Especially knowing you might be here." Clara gave a small nod. "I prefer not to make announcements," she said, and Margaret smiled knowingly. "You never did." The conversation moved naturally, effortlessly, and Ethan felt something unfamiliar again, not exclusion exactly, but displacement, as if he had stepped into a narrative that had already been written without him. He cleared his throat slightly, a subtle signal of presence, and Margaret turned toward him, her expression shifting into polite acknowledgement. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, offering a brief nod. Ethan returned it, composed, controlled. "Ms. Hensley," he replied, but the balance had already shifted. He could feel it in the way her attention returned to Clara almost immediately, in the way the conversation continued without adjusting to include him. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan was not the center of the interaction. He was simply part of the room. Clara glanced at him then, not dismissing, not inviting, just acknowledging. And in that single glance there was no trace of the dynamic from the restaurant. No hierarchy, no expectation, just two people standing in the same space with different understandings of it. "You seem surprised," she said quietly once Margaret had stepped away to greet someone else. Ethan let out a soft breath, this time closer to a genuine laugh, though still restrained. "I do not like being unprepared," he admitted, and it was more honest than he had intended. Clara considered that for a moment, her gaze steady. "Then you should stop assuming preparation only comes from control," she replied, and the words landed without force, but with precision. Ethan looked at her, really looked at her again, and this time there was no attempt to categorize, no immediate strategy forming behind his eyes, just attention, pure and undivided. "You worked at that restaurant," he said, not as a question, but as a statement he needed to confirm out loud. Clara nodded once. "I still do," she said. A brief pause. "I never left the ground I came from." And that answer disrupted his expectations all over again, because it did not fit, not with the dress, not with the connections, not with the quiet authority she carried so naturally. "Why?" he asked before he could stop himself. The question direct, unfiltered. Clara did not react defensively. She did not seem offended. She simply answered, "Because it reminds me what people look like when they think no one is watching." Ethan's expression stilled, the implication clear, not accusatory, not explicit, but present, and for a moment he did not respond, not because he could not, but because anything he said would reveal more than he was ready to offer. Around them the gala continued, conversations rising and falling, glasses clinking softly, the rhythm of an evening that was supposed to belong to him, to his vision, his influence, his control, but now it felt different, not diminished, but reframed, as if the center had shifted without anyone announcing it. "You could have said something," he said finally, his voice quieter now, less certain. Clara raised an eyebrow slightly. "About what?" she asked, and he hesitated, realizing there was no simple answer, no single moment where she had been expected to explain herself, because the expectation had never been hers to carry. It had been his to question, and he had not. "About who you are," he said eventually, and Clara's lips curved again, just slightly. You never asked who I was, she replied. You only decided what I was. And this time, Ethan did not look away. He did not deflect. He simply stood there and let the truth of it settle, not as an accusation, not as a defeat, but as a shift, the kind that changes something fundamental without needing to announce it. And in that moment, surrounded by light and music and carefully constructed appearances, Ethan Caldwell understood something he had not expected to learn tonight. That the most powerful change in a room does not come from the loudest voice, but from the quietest certainty. And Clara Whitmore had brought that certainty with her long before she ever walked through the door. The room continued to move, but Ethan Caldwell no longer moved with it in the same way. His steps slower, his attention no longer scattered across conversations and opportunities, but anchored, focused, and for the first time that evening, uncertain, Clara Whitmore stood just a few feet away, speaking quietly with another guest, her voice calm, measured, carrying just enough to be heard without ever demanding attention. And yet people leaned in when she spoke, not because they had to, but because they wanted to, because there was something in the way she chose her words that made them feel considered rather than impressed. Ethan watched this, not analyzing, not calculating, simply observing, and it unsettled him more than any direct challenge ever could, because there was nothing to push against, nothing to outmaneuver, just presence, and it was enough. A server passed by offering drinks. Ethan took one out of habit, then realized a second later he had not even looked at what it was. He set it down untouched on a nearby table, his mind elsewhere. Clara turned slightly, sensing the shift without needing to look directly, and when her conversation ended, she stepped away with the same quiet ease she had carried all night, until she was standing beside him again, not as an interruption, not as a continuation, just as a presence that neither of them could ignore anymore. You are quieter now, she said, her tone neutral, almost observational. Ethan let out a small breath, something close to a laugh but softer. I am listening, he replied, and the honesty in that answer surprised even him. Clara studied him for a moment, her gaze steady but not intrusive, as if weighing something unspoken. Then she nodded slightly. That is new, she said, and there was no judgment in her voice, just recognition. Ethan glanced around. The room, the conversations, the lights, the carefully curated elegance of it all, and for a moment it felt distant, like a scene he had seen too many times before. This was supposed to be my night, he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Clara followed his gaze, taking in the same space, the same details, but from a different perspective entirely. It still is, she said. You are just seeing it differently now. Ethan looked at her again, and this time there was no defense left in his expression, no need to maintain control over how he was perceived, just a quiet curiosity that had replaced his earlier certainty. And you? He asked, his voice lower, more deliberate. What is this night to you? Clara paused, not because she did not have an answer, but because she chose how to give it. A reminder, she said finally. Ethan tilted his head slightly, waiting, and she continued. That rooms like this are built on perception, not truth, she said, her eyes moving briefly across the crowd. And that perception changes the moment someone refuses to play along. Ethan felt that settle, not as a contradiction, but as an expansion of something he had always believed, but never questioned deeply. A voice interrupted them then, a man in a tailored navy suit approaching with purpose, his expression polite but intent. Miss Whitmore, he said, they are ready for you. Clara nodded once, as if she had been expecting this exact moment. Thank you, she replied, and then she turned to Ethan, not dramatically, not as a farewell, just a simple shift of attention. You should come, she said, and for a second he hesitated, not because he did not want to, but because he realized he did not know what he was about to step into, and that was unfamiliar territory for him. But something in her tone, not persuasive, not insistent, simply certain, made the decision for him. He nodded once. Lead the way, he said, and Clara did, moving through the crowd with quiet confidence, not asking for space, but receiving it anyway, until they reached a smaller room just off the main hall, more private, more focused, where a group of individuals stood in quiet discussion around a long table, documents laid out, expressions serious, This was not the social side of the gala. This was the part where decisions were made, where influence turned into action. The man who had approached her stepped aside as she entered, and the conversation shifted immediately, attention redirecting toward her without announcement, without introduction, as if her presence alone was enough. Ethan followed, stopping just inside the room, his gaze moving across the faces he recognized: investors, partners, people whose approval he had worked to secure, and then back to Clara, who now stood at the head of the table, not elevated, not positioned for dominance, but naturally centered. And in that moment, Ethan Caldwell understood something that no report, no meeting, no carefully planned strategy had ever shown him before. That power did not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it walked in quietly, waited patiently, and then changed everything without needing permission, and Clara Whitmore had just stepped fully into that kind of power, without raising her voice even once. The room settled into a different kind of silence, not empty, not uncertain, but focused, the kind of silence that only exists when every person present understands that something meaningful is about to happen. And Clara Whitmore did not rush to fill it. She simply placed her hand lightly on the edge of the table, her posture relaxed but grounded, her presence enough to hold the attention without effort. The documents in front of her remained untouched for a moment longer than expected, as if she was allowing the weight of the room to align before she spoke. Ethan Caldwell stood just behind and slightly to the side, close enough to hear every word, far enough to observe without interrupting. His usual instinct to step forward, to lead, to control, held back by something new, something quieter, respect, perhaps, or curiosity strong enough to override habit. One of the investors cleared his throat softly, a signal more than a necessity. "We have been reviewing the proposal," he began, his tone measured, professional, but with a trace of anticipation beneath it. Clara nodded once, acknowledging without encouraging interruption. And the man continued. "We are ready to proceed," he said carefully, "pending your final sign-off authority." A brief silence followed. Of course, she wasn't deciding tonight. She had decided long before she walked in. The words hung there, simple on the surface, but carrying implications that stretched far beyond the room. Ethan felt the shift immediately, not in the statement itself, but in what it revealed. This was not a negotiation where Clara was participating. This was one where she held the final decision. He remained still, his mind adjusting, recalibrating, not in panic, not in resistance, but in recognition of a reality he had not accounted for. Clara glanced down at the documents then, her fingers brushing the edge lightly, not reviewing, not searching, just acknowledging their presence. "You have structured it well," she said, her voice calm, even, and the compliment, though understated, seemed to ease something in the room, shoulders relaxing, tension softening, but only slightly, because the outcome still rested with her. She lifted her gaze again, meeting each person in turn, not scanning, not performing, simply seeing. "But," she added, and that single word shifted everything back into focus. The room leaned in, not physically, but in attention. Ethan felt it too, the subtle tightening, the expectation. Clara continued without raising her voice. "It is built on the assumption that control ensures stability," she said, her tone unchanged, but the statement landed with quiet precision. One of the partners exchanged a glance with another, a brief flicker of uncertainty crossing his expression. Clara did not pause for reaction. She continued. "Control creates the appearance of stability," she clarified, "but it often limits growth before it even begins." Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in disagreement, but in concentration, because he recognized the truth in her words, even if he had not framed it that way before. The same investor who had spoken earlier shifted his stance, adjusting his jacket. "And what would you suggest instead?" he asked, his voice careful now, less certain. Clara's gaze returned to him, steady, composed. "Trust," she said, and the word, simple as it was, carried more weight than any complex strategy. There was a brief silence, not resistant, but processing. Ethan felt it settle into him as well. The idea not unfamiliar, but rarely prioritized in the world he operated in. Clara reached for a pen then, her movement unhurried, deliberate, and she signed the document with a single smooth motion, no hesitation. No need for dramatics, just a decision made and executed. The room exhaled collectively, tension releasing in a way that was almost imperceptible but undeniable. Conversations began to stir again, quieter now, more focused, the kind that follow clarity rather than confusion. Clara set the pen down and stepped back slightly, not claiming the moment, not holding on to it, simply allowing it to pass as naturally as it had come. Ethan remained where he was, watching, not just the action, but the aftermath. The way people looked at her now, not with surprise, not even with admiration, but with recognition, as if they had always known this was her place, even if they had not seen it until now. Clara turned then, her attention returning to him, and for a moment the room faded again, not completely, but enough that the space between them felt separate, defined. "You should not look so surprised," she said softly, and there was no teasing in her voice, just a quiet observation. Ethan let out a breath he had not realized he was holding, his expression thoughtful, open in a way it had not been earlier that night. "I am not surprised anymore," he said, and this time it was true, not because he had expected it, but because he had accepted it. Clara studied him for a second, then nodded. Once, as if that answer mattered more than anything else he could have said, and as the room continued to move around them, decisions already shifting into action, Ethan Caldwell understood something that extended far beyond the deal that had just been signed. That power was not something you proved in a moment. It was something you carried consistently, quietly, until the moment came for it to be seen. And Clara Whitmore had never needed the room to recognize it. She had simply allowed it to happen. The energy in the room softened after the decision was made, not fading, but shifting into something quieter, more grounded, as if the outcome had removed the need for performance, and people now moved with a different kind of intention. Conversations resumed, but they were no longer about proving or persuading. They were about understanding what had just happened, and Ethan Caldwell stood there for a moment longer, watching the subtle aftermath unfold, watching how the same individuals who had once evaluated him were now glancing toward Clara Whitmore with a different kind of awareness, not admiration alone, but recognition. And Clara, as always, did not hold on to the moment. She stepped away from the table as naturally as she had approached it, her presence receding without diminishing, like a quiet note that lingered even after the sound had stopped. Ethan followed her with his eyes before finally moving, closing the distance between them again, not with urgency, but with intention. She had reached the edge of the room, where the noise from the main gala filtered in softly, and for a brief moment, they stood in that in-between space, neither fully inside nor completely removed, a pause between two different worlds. "You knew how that would end," Ethan said, his voice low, not accusatory, not even questioning, just acknowledging what now seemed obvious. Clara did not turn immediately. She rested her hand lightly against the wall beside her, feeling the cool surface for a second before responding. "I knew what I would choose," she said, and the distinction was subtle, but important. Ethan absorbed that, nodding slightly. "That is not the same thing," he said, and there was a trace of something new in his tone, not challenge, but curiosity. Clara glanced at him then, her expression calm, but her eyes more open now, less guarded. "No," she agreed. "It is not." Silence settled again, but this time it was different, not weighted with unspoken tension, but with something lighter, something forming. Ethan looked at her for a moment, then let out a quiet breath. "I owe you an apology," he said, and the words, though simple, carried more weight than anything he had said all night. Clara did not react immediately. She did not interrupt. She simply listened, allowing him the space to continue. "At the restaurant," he added, "I thought I understood the situation." He paused, searching for the right words, not to protect himself, but to be accurate. "I decided who you were before I had any reason to." Clara's gaze softened slightly, not because she needed the apology, but because she recognized the effort behind it. "That happens often," she said, her tone not dismissive, not forgiving, just honest. Ethan nodded, accepting that without defense. "It should not," he replied, and for a moment, that was enough. No resolution, no dramatic shift, just acknowledgement. And something about that made the space between them feel more balanced. Clara turned fully toward him now, her posture relaxed, her presence no longer carrying the same distance it had earlier. "Why did you invite me?" she asked, and the question was not confrontational, but it was direct. Ethan met her gaze, considering the answer more carefully than he would have hours ago. "Because I was bored," he said finally, and there was no pride in the admission, only honesty. "And because I thought it would be easy." Clara studied him for a second, then nodded once, as if confirming something she had already suspected. "And now?" she asked, her voice quieter, almost reflective. Ethan let out a small breath, his shoulders relaxing just slightly. "Now I am glad you said yes," he said, and this time there was no hesitation, no calculation, just truth. Clara's lips curved into the faintest smile, the first one that reached her eyes, subtle, but unmistakable. "Good," she said, and there was something lighter in her tone now, something almost playful, but still grounded. The noise from the gala grew slightly louder as someone opened the door behind them, laughter spilling into the hallway before fading again. Ethan glanced toward it briefly, then back at her. "Do you always do this?" he asked. Clara raised an eyebrow. "Do what?" she replied. Ethan gestured slightly, not toward the room, not toward the dress, but toward her. "Change the entire direction of a night without raising your voice." Clara considered that for a moment, then shook her head gently. "No," she said. "Only when it matters." Ethan let out a soft laugh, genuine this time, the tension that had followed him earlier finally easing. "I see," he said, and for a second, neither of them moved, the moment stretching just long enough to be noticed, but not long enough to become uncomfortable. Something unspoken settled there, not defined, not labeled, but present, a shift from opposition to understanding, from distance to something closer. And as they stood there, between the quiet intensity of the room behind them and the polished elegance of the gala beyond, Ethan Caldwell realized that the most unexpected part of the night was not the deal, not the revelation, but the person standing in front of him. And Clara Whitmore, without trying, without forcing, had turned what began as a careless invitation into something neither of them could ignore anymore. The night did not end with applause. It did not need to. The kind of shift that had taken place did not announce itself loudly. It settled into the room like something permanent, something that would be remembered long after the music stopped and the lights dimmed. And as the gala slowly began to wind down, the conversations grew softer, more reflective, as if everyone present had witnessed something they could not quite put into words. Ethan Caldwell stepped back into the main ballroom beside Clara Whitmore, but this time he did not lead. He did not guide the direction of the moment. He simply walked with her, and that difference, subtle as it was, changed everything. A few guests approached, offering polite words, congratulations, careful acknowledgments that now carried a different weight, and Ethan noticed something he had never paid attention to before. The way Clara responded to each person, not with obligation, not with rehearsed charm, but with genuine presence. She listened, she answered, she made each interaction feel complete without extending it unnecessarily. And people responded to that, not because they were trying to impress her, but because they felt seen in a way they were not used to. Eventually the crowd thinned, the music softened further, and the space between moments grew longer, more open, and Ethan found himself standing beside her near the large windows that overlooked the city, the skyline stretching out in layers of light and shadow, the kind of view he had seen countless times before, but never quite like this. "Do you always leave before the end?" he asked, his voice quieter now, more natural. Clara looked out at the city for a moment before answering. "I leave when I have seen what I needed to see," she said, and there was no finality in her tone, just clarity. Ethan nodded slightly, understanding more than he expected to. "And tonight," he continued, "did you see it?" Clara turned her head just enough to glance at him, her expression thoughtful. "I saw enough," she replied, and for a second, that answer felt like both a conclusion and a beginning. Ethan let out a small breath, his gaze returning to the city. "I used to think nights like this were about control," he said, almost to himself. Clara waited, giving the thought space to form. "About proving something," he added. "About making sure every outcome was exactly what I planned." Clara's lips curved faintly. "And now?" she asked softly. Ethan paused, considering, not rushing to answer. Now I think it is about paying attention, he said, and the simplicity of it felt more honest than anything else he could have said. Clara nodded once, as if that answer aligned with something she already believed. A quiet understanding passing between them without needing explanation. The city lights reflected faintly in the glass, blending their silhouettes with the skyline beyond, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the silence itself felt complete. Eventually, Clara stepped back from the window, her posture relaxed, her presence lighter now, as if the weight of the evening had already settled where it needed to. I should go, she said, and there was no hesitation in her voice, no uncertainty, just a decision made. Ethan turned toward her, not surprised, but not indifferent either. Back to the restaurant, he asked, and there was a trace of something in his tone, not disbelief, but curiosity. Clara nodded. I have a shift tomorrow, she said, as if that explained everything. And in a way, it did. Ethan let out a soft laugh, shaking his head slightly, not in confusion, but in quiet admiration. Of course you do, he said, and for a moment, the contrast between their worlds felt less like a divide and more like a connection, something that made the conversation richer rather than more complicated. Clara took a step back, then paused, her gaze meeting his again. You should come by sometime, she said, her tone casual, but her eyes steady. Not as a guest, she added, just as a person. Ethan held her gaze, the invitation simple, but carrying more meaning than any formal arrangement ever could. He nodded once. I will, he said, and this time, there was no question behind it, no calculation, just intention. Clara gave a small nod in return, then turned, walking toward the exit with the same quiet confidence she had carried from the moment she arrived, not looking back, not needing to, and Ethan watched her go, not with the detached interest he might have shown hours earlier, but with a quiet awareness that something had shifted in a way he could not undo. And as the doors closed behind her, the room felt different again, not emptier, but clearer, as if something unnecessary had been removed, leaving behind only what mattered. Ethan remained by the window for a moment longer, the city stretching out before him, unchanged and yet somehow new. And for the first time in a long while, he was not thinking about the next deal, the next strategy, the next move. He was thinking about a conversation, a presence, a person who had walked into his world without asking for permission and left it better than she found it. And somewhere between the noise of the gala and the quiet of the night outside, Ethan Caldwell understood something simple, something lasting, that respect is not earned by power. It is revealed by how you treat those you never expected to matter. And sometimes, the people you underestimate are the ones who teach you how to see clearly. And in that clarity, something unexpected begins, not loudly, not all at once, but steadily, quietly, like the beginning of something real. If this story touched you, do not keep it to yourself. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to see it, and share with us where you are watching from, and subscribe to When He Chose Her channel for more powerful, emotional stories about dignity, truth, and unexpected connections.